Do you have a website that is made up of mostly static content? Interested in learning about how you can maybe optimize for performance and think about things like cost savings as well? Well, tune into this episode as we talk all about the static content hosting pattern. Hello there, and welcome back to another episode of Cloud with Chris. You are with me, Chris Reddington, and we will be talking about all things cloud. Now we'll jump straight in once again, of course, to another of our episodes in the series of Architecting in the Cloud, one pattern at a time. And as I mentioned in the intro there, we will be talking about the static content hosting pattern there today. So it builds on quite nicely, actually. We've had a little bit of a theme recently talking about Hugo and some of the work that I've been doing in the open source community. And just as a reminder, Hugo is one of the many options available out in the community to go ahead and do static site generation. So taking a load of markup files, taking a load of information effectively, and translating that into some files that can be used to render a website at the end of the process there. So this is why I think this pattern is particularly relevant, because again, the static content hosting pattern that we'll be talking about today is not particularly anything new or revolutionary, but it's just formalizing an approach or a pattern that you can go and use to A, save on cost, and B, potentially get some performance gains as well. So let's go ahead and jump straight in and take a look at the Azure Architecture Center article here on the topic. So static content hosting, we've already alluded to it a little bit here, that the idea is if you've got a web application that is mostly made up of static content, so you're not dynamically rendering and generating content on the fly, it's very much static, so once you've actually rendered it once, it's there to stay, it's consistent. It might be HTML pages, it might be things like CSS files or images or whatnot. That is typically what we're talking about with static content here. So the thing to bear in mind is when you think about static content, when you think about things like servers that you might go and typically host, so IIS or App Service or Kestrel or whatever a server that you go and use to go and run your workloads there, it's probably not the best usage of those resources, because if you think about it, all the server is doing is just taking a file and serving it to your end users, which is going to take some computation to go and do that. But let's be fair, that's not really what a server is kind of there and intended to be. You know, a server is supposed to be there to do some complex routing potentially and some dynamic processing for us. We'd want to offload some of that easy to manage, easy to serve up content somewhere else. And that is really the idea behind the static content hosting pattern. Can we go and take those static files, and instead of having the server serve those things up, could we have somewhere else go and serve those things up? Now, in an Azure perspective, you're probably thinking of something like Azure Storage, potentially with Azure CDN. We'll talk about Azure CDN in a moment. With AWS, you're thinking of S3. And with GCP, you're thinking of the GCP storage solution there. And of course, each of those, again, you'll have some potential CDN options, but we'll come to that a bit later. So let's have a think about that then, because ultimately, if we want to serve that as a website, we need to be able to access that endpoint either using HTTP or HTTPS, so Hypertext Transfer Protocol, or the secure equivalent. Now, Azure by default allows you to connect into HTTP and HTTPS to a blob storage account if it's been enabled for the kind of web static content option there. So you're probably thinking at this point, Chris, why are you going to go and talk about CDN? Because I can already get that straight through blob storage. That will all become clear as we move through this particular pattern here. But let's first focus on some of these issues and considerations. So we've talked about the fact that we need to have HTTP or HTTPS. If we are thinking about performance in particular, then we should really consider a CDN for one of two reasons, primarily from my perspective. Number one is to do with where our users are located. If my storage account, which is hosting all of these static files, is hosted in, say, West Europe, for example, and I have users all the way out in Australia, which is quite reasonable given I've had folks from Australia, New Zealand, etc. on Cloud with Chris, then they're going to get a really bad experience just because of the speed of light. That's something, obviously, we can't change unless you've changed the laws of physics. But what we can do is we can slightly re-architect that and use a CDN to distribute that content out and make it available at various points of presence across the globe, so nearer to our users. So performance is the one side of things there for our end users. The other piece is to do with performance of our storage account itself. So if we just change the page over here just for a moment and take a look at the scalability limits of Azure Storage, there is one in particular that is worth knowing about, and that's the maximum request rate of a storage account, which is 20,000 requests per second. Now, I would love to get my podcast, my web page, to the level where it can handle 20,000 requests per second. Not quite there yet, but definitely on a journey. And the point, though, that I'm making here, right, is the fact that you've got an artificial bottleneck at this point of 20,000 requests a second if you store all of your assets inside of a storage account. And if you're requesting all of those assets at once from the same storage account, let's say there's 10 files, then you can go and do the maths, right? You can go and divide by 10, and that's suddenly 2,000 requests that you've got per second. And you can go and factor that as and how you need to based upon your own site. So there is potentially a bottleneck in terms of hitting the storage account limits. So why a CDN? Because the CDN could be where your users have to actually go and navigate to, and that offloads some of that compute and some of those requests from the actual storage account itself. Similar concept with S3 buckets, similar concept with the same with Google storage as well. So if we just jump back, so we've talked about CDN, we've talked about HTTP and HTTPS. Geo-replication is another piece, so having resilience against events which might affect a data center. So that is a nice reason to think about things like storage accounts, where typically it's easier to replicate across regions than it is, say, a server where there may be some caching and there may be some complexity in terms of what's running on the server and how you deal with state, for example. Now, overall, you can see the issues and considerations there that we've just talked through. Overall, the main point here is that the storage accounts, the S3 buckets, the Google storage bucket there as well, that has to be publicly available for people to go and access that content. So if there are particular aspects that you do need to go ahead and have, let's say, secret or secure, for example, then that might be where you want to go ahead and take a look at the valet key pattern. The valet key pattern is one that we'll explore in a separate episode. So if you're interested in that, certainly take a look at that episode. And once we've released that, I'll make sure it's linked in this description here as well. So when would you want to go and use this pattern? Well, we've already been saying it a couple of times here. If you want to optimize on cost for a site that is particularly static, and it's not really got any dynamic nature, you don't need any of that compute to go and determine what to render on the page at the time the user's interacting with it, then this is probably a good pattern for you to go and consider. Minimizing that cost of those static content resources and really just depending on the capabilities of that storage subsystem. So Azure Storage, S3, and Google Cloud Storage. Now, there are some scenarios where maybe it's not so applicable, for example. So if you think about the scenario where the application needs to have some kind of processing on the static content before it's delivered to the client, storage accounts and storage buckets aren't going to be able to do that for you. They are literally dumb storage. They just hold the information. They are there, and you can serve that content up to your users. There's no real pre-processing or processing that happens there with that. And really, when you think about the volume of the content that you're accessing there as well, what you've got to think about is the complexity of moving that static content away from something like a server. Because if you already have, let's say, a load of dynamic information, dynamic pages, PHP pages, .NET pages, whatever they are, for example, hosted in something like App Service, IIS, or whatever platform you're hosting on, what is the cost of you pulling out all of those static asset files and those various bits and pieces that you need and decomposing that into two separate applications? Of course, it's possible, but like we've said in other of these architecting in the cloud one pattern at a time episodes, what is the cost of you doing that? Is it really worth the expense and the time of doing that? Do you get that cost benefit? And what really is the underlying requirement for you to go and do that? So with that, at this point, normally we kind of talk through some examples, which we will. But I wanted to do it slightly differently for this episode. Given that we've already been talking about Hugo, GitHub Actions, and a few other pieces, I wanted to talk about Cloud with Chris and how I've handled things with the static content hosting pattern. So if you're watching, you'll be able to see on screen here that I have my GitHub Actions workflow. And this is for the latest release that has gone out. I just released my second vlog a few days ago. And this one is to my main website. So it's the www. Now, the interesting thing, as you see on this page, again, if you're not, just imagine a GitHub Actions workflow. But if you're listening in, what I've got is the GitHub Actions page with my build step, my publish step, and I have my artifacts that have been generated, one of which is an artifact called website. Now, that website artifact contains the generated files from the command called Hugo build. What does Hugo build do? Well, all it does, if I go ahead to my repository here, it converts all of my markdown files that I have in my repository and takes those into a format where they're HTML, CSS, images, etc., based upon some kind of Hugo theme. So what I'm doing is I'm taking the raw markdown content, transforming it into HTML, CSS, images, JavaScript, and then putting that into my artifact then, which I can use as part of my release process. And that's all we're doing. So really, we're just taking a load of static content and putting it there in our artifact file. And what I do in my publish step is I go ahead, take those files, scoop them up, push them to Azure Storage, and then purge the CDN that I already have in place to make sure that we are going ahead and serving the latest and greatest content. So just to prove that, I'm going to navigate over to my Azure portal here. You can see I've got my resource group here for Cloud with Chris. I've got several CDN endpoints. I have a few different storage accounts for the different stages of my application tier. So I have kind of an early preview storage account. I have a staging storage account, which is anything ready for release to go into production. And then I have my production storage account. And that's where all of my podcast files and my website itself resides. So if we take a look at Cloud with Chris prod and take a look at my containers and take a look at the $web folder, that's just the convention inside of Azure Storage to go and use the static website functionality. Of course, it will be slightly different for S3, as the same with Google Cloud Storage solution there. And I actually host Cloud with Chris across all three, by the way. Or rather, I have deployed to all three. I still need to route my CDN to all three as a backend. Haven't quite done that yet. But what you'll see if you're viewing the video, if not, I'll explain, is a folder of, or rather a set of folders of all of the different content areas that I have generated. So the various blog posts, the various episodes that I've worked on, the various files that we need for that are then in those subfolders. So if we navigate, for example, to the API-economy folder, which is the API economy episode that Peter and I did a while ago, you can see there is an index.html file in that particular page, in that particular folder. If we navigate and load more, we will see, for example, that there are images.css files, there is index.html, sitemaps, there are, for example, JavaScript folders, there are things like static content in there as well, images, fonts, etc. So you get the idea as we're explaining this, that all of these different files that are generated are literally just static content that is not going to change. And if it does need to change, well, then I just need to rebuild my site, rebuild the application, and go and republish it to my CDN. So now let's move on and take a look at the CDN aspect. So I've mentioned it a few times that the CDN is fronting my Azure storage account. So it's offloading some of the transactions that need to go to my backend Azure storage. So it's not every single user request needs to go to Azure storage. If the content is not available in the CDN, then the CDN will reach out to the backend origin, so the Azure storage account, and then populate the CDN so other users don't have to make that same hit on the storage account there. So we're protecting that IOPS limit, and we're also making sure that the content is in a point of presence very close to the end user there. So let's just take a look at my Cloud with Chris. There we go. That's the one, Cloud with Chris endpoint. So you can see this is the www.cloudwithchris.com. And as I take a look at my origin, you will see that I've got two endpoints here. Now, those two endpoints are my redundant endpoints. So my I think I deployed in GeoZone redundant, if I remember rightly. So you'll see one is the primary endpoint, one is the secondary endpoint. So if for some reason at a point where an end user goes to request the content through the CDN and one of my origins is offline, it will fail over to the other origin and try that one as well. So it's just, again, thinking about that resilience and thinking about keeping things going there. But again, there's nothing special, there's nothing fancy going on here. All that I've done is configured a custom domain on this particular CDN endpoint, www.cloudwithchris.com, enabled the custom HTTPS certificate, and the backend origins are just pointing to those storage accounts that we were looking at a moment ago, or the storage account, and that particular $web container. Now, that is it. That is as simple as the static content hosting pattern is. So you could be saving yourself quite a lot of money rather than hosting on an expensive underlying compute, virtual machines, app service, Kubernetes, whatever it is. And instead, you could go ahead and offload that into a Azure storage account with CDN. Of course, it depends on the scenario. If you have some dynamic content in there, maybe it won't work so well, but there are ways around that, using things like JavaScript and calling from APIs or calling to APIs, for example. So do at least consider this pattern, because it could save you quite a bit of money, and it could go ahead and help you from a performance perspective as well, and easily reach your users where they are. So with that, thank you for listening, and I hope this has been an interesting episode to help you along your journey with the Azure architecture patterns and along your journey into the Jamstack world as well. So you know what to do. If you liked this episode, please go ahead and hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and you can like us on Spotify, on Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, or of course cloudwithchris.com. You can view there as well. Please do share on with your own networks if you like the content. I am trying to hit 500 subscribers by the end of 2021, so I would love your support on that journey. With that, thank you for watching, and until next time, bye for now.